Hello, this is Cody, your postal GM, sending a howdy out there to all my Portland postal pathfinders. Rise of the Rulelords uses trademarks and or copyrights owned by Paizo Inc., used under Paizo's community use policy. We are expressly prohibited from charging you to use or access this content. Rise of the Rulelords is not published, endorsed, or specifically approved by Paizo. For more information about Paizo Inc. and Paizo's products, please visit paizo.com. And don't let the rules rule you.
Uh-oh. Looks like you better get that checked out. You might have a condition? It's time for Rise of the Rulelords! Well, howdy, stranger. Set a spell, but leave your boots on. I bet you were expecting that dastardly and duplicitous Rulelord Pete. Well, for this episode, I'll be your Huckleberry. The name's Snake Eyes, the kobold gambling gunslinger of Golarion. Now, I've played Knivesies in many a saloon to know that you ain't gonna get far in this world without knowing a thing or two about conditions. What are those you're a-pondering? Well, conditions change your state of being in some fashion. Could be applying some kind of bonus, or maybe some malevolent status penalty. There are, however, quite a number of them, so we're gonna cover this in 3 parts. The good, the bad, and the ugly. Maybe some dang Baba Yaga went and hexed you with the chicken curse, keeping you saddled to the privy for a week. Or maybe some dang fool had a bad luck of cards and went and grabbed you.
I'm gonna pump you full of lead.
In either case, no matter how you got sickened or grabbed, it's gonna work the same way even if it happens to you in a different circumstance. That said, some creatures with unique abilities, or maybe even a spell, might change how the condition is applied to you. For example, it might make the effects last for longer, or it might put a requirement on how the condition is removed. That condition will remain persistent until the terms dictated on the condition itself cause it to end. Now, before you go gallivanting off into the sunset, there's 2 things about conditions you ought to know. Number 1, some conditions have a numerical value, called a condition value, indicated by a numerical following the condition. The value conveys the severity of the condition, and such conditions often give you a bonus or penalty equal to their value. These values can often be reduced by skills, spells, or simply waiting. If a condition value is ever reduced to 0, the condition ends. An exemplification might be if the chicken curse is making you sicken 2, you'll take a status penalty equal to 2 on all of your checks and DCs. But if you successfully upchuck your meal, that might reduce you to sickened 1, meaning you'll only take a -1 to your checks and DCs. See how it works? The other thing is that conditions don't stack, but they can override. For example, that dude looking for a beating caterwauling that you had a queen instead of a king, which is true, but they don't know that you cheated. Now, if he puts the hand he feels comfortable losing on your personage, you might be grabbed. And if some other sorry soul goes and grabs you, you won't be double grabbed or grabbed too, but you could be getting close to being restrained, in which case the restrained condition would override the grabbed condition. This is always specified by the entry for the overriding condition. When it happens, all effects of the overriding condition are suppressed until the overriding condition ends. The condition's duration continues to elapse, and it might run out while suppressed. This is particularly important when discussing persistent damage. You see, when I socked that fool in the jaw, he started to bleed 1. Now, when I introduced his face to a table, the crit failed on his save, and became bleeding 2. Now, because he was bleeding 1 doesn't mean that he now becomes bleeding 3. Rather, the bleeding 2 takes over. The bleeding 2 might have a duration of 1 round, whereas the bleeding 1 might have a duration of a minute. In which case, once 1 round passes, the bleeding 2 might stop, but the bleeding 1 will persist until it's bandaged up. And let me tell you, you're gonna need a lot of spit and shine before you make that face pretty again. Now, without further ado, let's skip the rambling and get to the gambling.
Snake Eyes, what are you doing?
Oh hell, it's the fuzz.
Snake Eyes, get back onto Path Builder. I can't possibly maintain your character voice for an entire episode.
You might have won this time, you cactus coddling, fought freckle ninny hammer, glumpus gadabout, yellow belly barber's cat, but you ain't seen the last of old Snake Eyes. Scamper.
Okay, sorry about that, folks. You come up with one bit for a little joke, and then suddenly it thinks it can take over the whole podcast. But anyway, let's see what he covered. Well, I mean, those are the basics of conditions. They're persistent until they're removed. They have values, and they don't stack, but they could override. So let's get started with the good conditions. These are conditions that you might want to have, or maybe aren't that bad when you get them. A lot of this is going to be up to personal preference. Paizo certainly doesn't categorize them as such, but it'll help differentiate how panicked you should get if you ever get one of them. In the bad conditions episode, we'll go over some conditions that, they're not great, but they're not going to ruin your day. They're also probably some of the more common conditions that you're ever going to face as a player. And when we get to the ugly conditions, well, those you're going to have a bad time with. They are truly terrifying. But before getting into it, I think this is a good time to make a totally unsponsored recommendation for the Paizo condition cards. Of all the many useful tools that Paizo produces and sells, the condition cards I think are the most useful. They're a great resource for both players and GMs, both when you're playing online or at the table. When you get hit with a condition, or if you're a GM hitting a player with a condition, you can pull out one of these cards and hand it to them. It has all the information about the various condition, and you can just give it back to the GM when you're all done, or sort it back into your deck. Either way. In my own personal opinion, if it came between getting the GM screen, which does have the conditions on it, or the condition cards, get the cards. With that, let's start talking conditions. Some conditions are grouped up together. Their degrees of detection, senses, death and dying, attitudes, and lowered abilities. For our first set of conditions, we're going to start with attitudes. Attitudes are mostly a GM tool that they can use on NPCs. In pre-written adventures, some NPCs have their attitudes stated, and the conditions under which a player could change it. In this episode, we'll be going over helpful to unfriendly. Hostile, we'll say for later. Now, your GM is probably not going to keep a sliding scale noting when a NPC is friendly or helpful, then goes back down to friendly or becomes indifferent. Rather, they're probably just going to roleplay the situation and react in accordance to whatever the players say to that NPC. However, if the players try to influence the NPC with either a role like intimidation or diplomacy, the attitude list can provide a mechanical means of judging whether a NPC complies with them or not. Of note, in all of these conditions, no role will ever force an NPC to do something that they don't want to do. There is no roll high enough that you can make in diplomacy to make someone throw themselves at you to suit your carnal pleasures. Nor is there an intimidation roll high enough that will make a bad guy feel compelled to tell you 100% of the truth. Rather, these rolls might help improve how they interact with you. You may make such a flattering diplomacy roll that the barkeep feels much more inclined to give you information and possibly engage in a consensual night of fun. Your intimidation roll might scare a goblin so much that they will tell you where the device is hidden, but they won't tell you about the trap that's laid there. Most NPCs are probably indifferent towards the players. This creature couldn't care one way or the other about the character's needs or wants. They're not particularly mean or particularly friendly towards the players, they're just background noise in the grand story of the NPC's life. However, if the players are rude to them or tries to intimidate them to coerce them into giving them all their money, for example, because that never happens, am I right? That character could easily become unfriendly. When a creature has this condition, it both dislikes and specifically distrusts the characters. If the players try to make a request of the character, they'll say no. Now I know what you're saying. Pete, you said this was going to be the good conditions episode. That doesn't sound very good. Well, players are going to encounter a lot of unfriendly NPCs. The good news is that many of them can be convinced with a good diplomacy roll to at least become indifferent towards the characters. Players could bribe the character or maybe accomplish a task for them and at least make the character indifferent or possibly go to the next level of being friendly. The point being that an unfriendly character can be redeemed. Friendly characters like the players. The players can attempt to make a request of the friendly creature, and the friendly creature is likely to agree to a simple and safe request that doesn't cost much to fulfill. If the player or one of their allies uses hostile actions against the character gains a worse attitude condition depending on the severity of the hostile action as determined by the GM. Note again, just because they're friendly does not mean that they're going to give you everything that you want just because you ask. You'll still have to work for it and be nice to them in order to get them to comply with you. The best condition that you want an NPC to be at is helpful. An NPC that's helpful to the players wishes to actively aid the players. Players can make reasonable requests of the NPC, and as long as such requests aren't at the expense of the helpful character's goals or quality of life, they're likely to say yes. And as always, if someone gets an attitude at them, their level of helpfulness might go down. In all of these cases, only a supernatural effect like a spell can impose that condition on a player. A player can't roll intimidation or diplomacy against another player to make them more helpful or compliant. That takes away player agency, which is not something that Pathfinder 2nd Edition is about. Again, all of these attitudes are on a sliding scale. You can absolutely make a helpful creature turn hostile towards you, or you could potentially make a hostile creature friendly towards you. It just depends on how well you roleplay and how well you roll. I feel that a good GM would provide some kind of diplomatic means to end an encounter in almost every circumstance. There are, of course, absolutely situations where there is nothing to be redeemed about a character. However, if a player wants to try, give them a shot. See how well it goes, see what they say. You may still determine that no matter what, that character is gonna be a bad guy. But you never know, there could be something said that's so impactful that it can turn the most stone-hearted villain into a hero. The next group of conditions are ones that every single ranger, rogue, and stealth-minded player should have memorized. The degrees of detection. The detection rules are unique in my opinion because both players and non-playable characters are going to want to have the detection rules work in their favor. Roguish devils and devilish rogues are both going to want to try to get a sneak attack in. While one creature might be hiding for their life from the players might hide from their life from some certain creatures. The rules work both ways for them. Now, because these rules are so complicated and I've already gone over all of them in the GM episode, I'm just going to give you the GM screen version of each of these conditions. The first is observed. A creature you're observed by knows where you are and can target you normally. Of special note though, you can only observe a creature with a precise sense, which doesn't necessarily have to be sight. However, if a creature is hidden and you're only using an imprecise sense, like hearing or smell, then the creature will remain hidden rather than observe even if you detect them. When you're hidden, a creature you're hidden from knows the space that you're in. It's flat-footed to you and must succeed at a DC 11 flat check to affect you. You can hide and become hidden and seek to find hidden creatures. Now for you rogues that use sneak attack, I think it's a common misconception that you have to be hidden in order to get sneak attack. In actuality, you should note that a creature only has to be flat-footed to you to be able to use sneak attack. Being hidden is definitely one of the routes that you can take to get a sneak attack in. However, there's also actions like feint, create a diversion, or flanking a creature that can also make a creature flat-footed to you. You could also be undetected. When you're undetected by a creature, it's flat-footed to you. It also can't see you, has no idea what space you occupy, and can't target you. If you're playing on a map, the creature can try to guess what square you're on by picking a square and attempting to attack. While it works the same as targeting a hidden creature, the flat check and attack roll are rolled in secret by the GM. This, of course, doesn't really matter if it's a bad guy trying to target a player, because the GM is probably already rolling behind a screen. However, if a player is trying to target an undetected creature, that's when the GM would make the roll for the player. In addition, the GM gets to be a sneaky son of a gun by not revealing whether the attack missed due to failing the flat check, failing the attack roll, or simply choosing the wrong square. I know, what a scamp. Even better than being hidden or undetected is unnoticed. The creature that you're unnoticed by is totally unaware of your presence. While functionally it works exactly the same as being undetected by a creature, there are certain abilities that can only affect creatures that are totally unaware of your presence. The least common of these detection levels is invisible, where you're undetected by everyone. Unless someone uses magic or some kind of special ability, you cannot become observed while you're invisible. To become invisible, however, will probably require some kind of potion, piece of equipment, or a spell. Hiding in the deepest, darkest shadow will still not make you invisible, just unnoticed at best. Creatures can still find you though, even if you're invisible. If they attempt a perception check against your stealth DC and they succeed, you just become hidden to that creature until you sneak away or become undetected again. Or, if you become invisible while someone can already see you, you start out as hidden to the observer until you successfully sneak away. Another condition that is both sort of in the detection area and sort of in the senses area is concealed. A creature that you're concealed from must succeed at a DC 5 flat check when targeting you with a non-area of effect. So you're still able to be observed, but you're just a little tougher to target. Hidden, undetected, and unnoticed all revolve around a creature's awareness of where you are. However, with concealed, you'll often gain this benefit from some kind of environmental factor, like fog, thick trees, stone columns. Observed, hidden, undetected, and unnoticed are all groups of conditions that can be overridden by another. You won't be observed and unnoticed by the same creature at the same time. Rather, it will be either or. However, you can always be observed and concealed, or hidden and concealed, or undetected and concealed, or unnoticed and concealed. Both invisibility and concealed are in the senses group of conditions, whereas the others are in the degrees of detection group of conditions. Now there are two other senses that I'm going to cover in this episode of good conditions. Most players are probably going to regard these as bad. However, Paizo does have rules so that players can use these conditions as part of their character build, and run with them permanently as perfectly viable characters. Those conditions are blind, where you're unable to see, and deafened, where you're unable to hear. When you're blind, all normal terrain is difficult terrain for you. You also can't detect things using vision, and you automatically critically fail perception checks that require you to be able to see, and if your vision is only precise, you take a -4 penalty to perception checks. However, you are also immune to visual effects. In the same vein, when you're deafened, you automatically critically fail perception checks that require you to be able to hear. You take a -2 status penalty to perception checks for initiative and checks that involve sound, but also rely on some other senses. If you perform an action with the auditory trait, you must succeed at a DC 5 flat check or the action is lost. You should attempt the check after spending the action but before any effects are applied. The good news is that you're immune to auditory effects. Now, why on earth would I say that these are good conditions? Well, because they're real, actual people who have these conditions every single day of their real lives. They are an impediment, but do not have to be a barrier to living full and healthy lives. In the same vein, player characters in Pathfinder can also have these disabilities. In the Grand Bazaar, part of the Lost Omens series, they added a number of assistive items so that adventurers can continue to adventure without encountering significant roadblocks. These include canes, hearing aids, wheelchairs, reading rings, and vision assistants. Now, rules as written, if a player does have one of these conditions on them as an aspect of their character, they will suffer those negative effects. However, with an assistive item, they may be able to meet or exceed quote-unquote normal vision or hearing. While the average character will typically have vision as a precise sense and hearing as an imprecise sense, and gaining these conditions will impose a pretty significant penalty on them. For some players that choose, it does not have to be a bad thing. It can be an awesome and flavorful character choice. There is another condition that does impact the senses, but it's typically associated with the death and dying rules. That's unconscious. Why is it a good condition? Because, well, you can also be asleep and be unconscious. And I don't know about you, but I rather like being asleep. Either way, whether you're sleeping in a tavern or been knocked out from a battle, you can't act. While you're unconscious, you will take a -4 penalty to AC, perception, and reflex saves, and you'll also have the blinded and flat-footed conditions. As soon as you fall unconscious, you'll also fall prone and drop all items that you're wielding or holding unless the effect or GM states otherwise. Now, most players are probably going to become unconscious from battle, in which case it's most likely associated with dying. The good news is that you're still alive. The bad news is everything else. If you only have 0 hit points, you can't wake up until you gain at least 1 more hit point. Once your faithful healer heals you, or one of your allies jams a potion of healing down your throat, and you gain that 1 extra healing point, then you'll lose the dying and unconscious condition, and then you can start to act normally. Say, however, that the healers run out of spells, no one has any potions on them, and no one is skilled in medicine. Your group has a lot bigger problems that they need to sort out long term. However, if you're still unconscious, don't worry, you can still recover naturally to 1 hit point after sufficient time. Could be an hour, could be a minute, could be 10 minutes, could be 10 hours. As long as you receive some kind of healing during this time, then you'll get to wake up and lose the unconscious condition. However, let's say that you're unconscious and have more than 1 hit point because you're either asleep or something caused you to be unconscious. You can still wake up. Pay close attention because these can be the difference between you dying from a surprise goblin attack or survival. First, someone could just shake you awake. That's pretty easy. You could also wake up from a very loud noise. Now, I don't know about some of you early birds, but I have slept through an alarm or two. So a battle could be raging all around you and you might still not wake up. Rather, at the start of your turn, attempt a perception check against the noise DC. If you succeed, then you wake up. But if creatures are trying to stay quiet, then you use your perception check against their stealth DC. But if you're unconscious because of some kind of magic on you, you might not be able to do that perception check at all. Wah wah. But if that battle is raging on, you are probably going to take damage. And guess what? Taking damage can wake you up. Whoa! As long as the damage doesn't reduce you to 0 hit points, then you can still wake up. But if it does, then you stay unconscious and start to gain the dying condition as usual. If that happens, and you receive healing rather than the natural healing you get from resting, then you can also wake up. Or if you're simply asleep, the GM can decide that you wake up just because you've had a restful night's sleep. Man, wouldn't that be great to have a full, restful sleep? But such things only exist in the land of fantasy. We'll cover death and dying more later. However, it's worth noting that when you do get to 0 hit points, whether you're unconscious or just straight dying, you'll move up in initiative order right before the creature that made you fall unconscious. When you wake up, you will still stay in that initiative order. This is so that, especially in situations where you might be facing just one creature, you as a player will get to have at least 1 recovery check. Because you're so vulnerable when you're unconscious, If you stayed in initiative order after the creature that downed you, that creature might have a chance to be able to kill you straight up. That move in initiative is so important so that if you succeed at your recovery check, you might be able to get up under the right conditions and save your butt. And the final good action that we'll be going over is Quickened. But before we go into that, let's go over some housekeeping! First off, have you heard of Beginner Box Day? If you're following me on Twitter, probably. But if you're not, here's all the information about it. Some of you probably already know that I'm also a mod on the subreddit Pathfinder 2E. We're organizing our first large event called Beginner Box Day. On April 23rd to 24th of 2002, experienced game masters will be teaching new and interested players about how to play Pathfinder 2E using Paizo's beginner box adventure, Menace Under Otari. The event is totally free, and both players and game masters will be eligible for awards. Paizo Organized Play will be supplying free PDFs of the beginner's guide to game masters who register. Both players and game masters can also earn achievement points for playing here, just like any other society scenario. Points that are good for character creation, items, and other things. And as a special bonus, the mods of Pathfinder 2E have a beginner's box, as well as copies of the Lost Omens books that we're going to be giving away at random. Game masters who run both the upper and lower level of the beginner box adventure will be eligible to receive a free beginner box, distributed by raffle. Both players and all game masters will be eligible to be raffled one of the Lost Omens books. Finally, Organized Play is also giving us vouchers that we can distribute to game masters and players at random. The more game masters who sign up for slots, the bigger the level of support Org Play is able to give us. We want to make sure that every single new player has a GM to play with. I'd much rather have to tell a GM that there aren't enough players for them than tell waiting players that there's not enough GMs for them to try out Pathfinder 2nd Edition. So if you're an experienced GM who's ready to introduce the next generation of Pathfinder players to the game, register today, either on the subreddit r/Pathfinder2E, or go to the description of this podcast where I'll have a link to our website. And players, if you're curious about playing, make sure to register as a player. If you also know people who are interested in Pathfinder 2nd Edition but have never found an opportunity to play, make sure to invite them as well. We know that as good as Pathfinder 2nd Edition is, sometimes it can be hard to find other people to play with. This day is dedicated to bridging that gap, introducing more people to the game, and expanding the total player base. Game Master registration closes March 26th, and player registration closes on April 11th. This is so that we have time to create RPG Chronicle slots for players to sign up depending on their time zone, as well as create individual Discord servers in the Pathfinder 2E subreddit Discord channel. After registration closes, we'll try to match you with game masters who are able to run in your time zone, as well as possibly with GMs who have your same level of TTRPG experience. All you have to do is register for free for a Pathfinder Society org number, as well as join our Discord. Besides a little bit of setup time, everything is completely for free. So if you're ready to begin your adventure into Pathfinder 2nd Edition, we'll see you on Beginner Box Day. My second piece of housekeeping is that I really want your community use policies! If you too want to be as cool as Cody, go to rulelord2e.com, which will take you to my anchor page, and click message. Then create a recording with a brief little intro to yourself, say hi to someone, or even plug your product. Recite Paizo's community use policy, but just insert Rise of the Rulelords. Then finish off with our tagline, "Don't let the rules rule you!" For each new episode that I produce, I'll put one of these voiceovers at the start, making you a permanent part of the podcast. And if you don't want to do Anchor's little sign-up thing, you can also send recordings to rulelord2e@gmail.com. This can be audio or video. No matter how you send it, just send it. I'd love to get them and make you an honorary Rulelord. And finally, I'm gonna be at PaizoCon 2022! The plague might not be over, but I'm as juiced up against it as they'll let me be. I'll be running society scenarios on both Friday and Saturday. I don't know what yet, but keep an eye out for my table when you register for PaizoCon 2022. Alright, enough about me. Let's talk about Quickened. Quickened is probably players' favorite condition as it has the most obvious mechanical benefit. You gain 1 additional action at the start of your turn each round. That's right, instead of the standard 3 actions, you can have 4! Maybe even more? Quickened can be granted in a number of ways, such as the Bard's Allegro, the spell Haste, or the Monk Feat Enduring Quickness. The caveat to Quickened is that you can only use the type of actions that whatever the ability is that granted you Quickened grants you. So for example, the spell Haste, you can only use the Quickened action that you gain for Strike and Stride actions. Meanwhile, the Monk's Enduring Quickness gives you an extra action but only to leap or stride, or provide an action needed to high or long jump. The effect that gave you Quickened will specify which of the actions you can use for that additional action. And if you become Quickened from multiple sources, you can use the extra action you've been granted for any single action allowed by any of the effects that made you Quickened. However, Quickened only takes effect at the start of your turn. So if you cast something on yourself that gains Quickened, you don't immediately gain it during your turn. Now let's say that you're Quickened as well as Slowed, which takes away 1 action. You can choose to use the action that you gain from Haste to be the one that you lose from Slowed, effectively nullifying both conditions, at least for as long as either effect lasts. It's worth noting that if you're using Quickened to make 4 attack rolls, your multiple attack penalty will proceed as usual, starting from nothing to 5 to 10, but then it'll stop at 10. You won't go down to 15 for the 4th action, it'll just stay at a -10. Because you'll still have that penalty, even though you could use that extra action to attack, doesn't necessarily mean that you should. A tactic to remember is that it still takes enemies in action to be able to stride as well, so maybe you just get in 3 attacks, then move your speed away from the enemy. Then they have to use one of their stride actions to catch up to you, effectively making them only have 2 actions to strike back at you. Just a little GM tip. Take it or leave it. With that, those are the best conditions in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. While Paizo could possibly add more, I don't see that happening. They've already stated that they've made all of their core rulebooks that they're making, being the core rulebook, Advanced Player's Guide, and 3 bestiaries, as well as the Game Master Guide. Other rulebooks, such as Guns and Gears, Secrets of Magic, and the upcoming Dark Archives, will likely just expand on the use of these set conditions. As we get into the bad and the ugly conditions, it's worth trying to remember what each of these conditions roughly do. In fact, both in the core rulebook and on the Game Master screen, there are simplified versions of each of the conditions. Let's go through them just for good measure. Friendly. An NPC with this condition has a good attitude towards you. Helpful. An NPC with this condition wants to assist you. Indifferent. An NPC with this condition has no strong feelings one way or the other about you. Unfriendly. An NPC with this condition doesn't like you. Hidden. A creature you're hidden from knows your location but can't see you. Observed. You're in plain view. Undetected. A creature you're undetected by doesn't know where you are. Unnoticed. A creature is entirely unaware you're present. Invisible. Creatures can't see you. Concealed. Fog or similar obstruction makes you difficult to see and target. Blinded. You're unable to see. Deafened. You're unable to hear. Unconscious. You're asleep or knocked out. Quickened. You get an extra action each turn. So what you thinking about? Did you learn about conditions? Did I use too much snake eyes, or do you want to see him return? Let me know on Twitter at Rulelord2e. And make sure to send me those voiceovers at rulelord2e.com. And I'll see you on Beginner's Box Day on April 23rd to 24th. But until next session,
Don't let the rules rule you.
dang it, Snake Eyes!